morning, Green Spring. I'm Gray Parks, the host this morning of Who's Who, and we'll be talking with Charlie Bliss. Charlie Bliss is a centenarian, and he's been here for 14 years at Green Spring. And he may be a centenarian, but he's still active in the working world. He's still applying for patents. So let me tell you just a little bit about Charlie's career, and I'll essentially read to you from his bio because it's a rather concentrated, and it sort of summarizes 78 years of working. Charlie Bliss's career has focused on the production and utilization of fossil energy forms, ranging from oil shales through the petroleum, coal, and natural gas. He is also focused on technical and economic development activities in emerging countries, involving long-term residencies in Colombia, the Philippines, Nigeria, and Pakistan. He has analyzed, made recommendations, and implemented many of his recommendations for major supply and processing activities in the pyro and the hydrometallurgical production of iron and steel, copper, cobalt, and nickel. His career has involved long-term employment with a major engineering, procurement, and construction firm, a major consulting firm, in the United States Agency for International Development. Most recently, he has served as an independent consultant, having ad hoc affiliations with a number of consulting firms. Charlie, that was a lot of words, and that sort of fills up 78 years. And but before we get into that, I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about you, your family. So let's talk about your current family. How many children do you have, and where do they live, and what do they do?
Well, I have a daughter. They're all Canadians, incidentally.
Oh, is that right?
They live in Ottawa and Toronto. A daughter who's an art historian at Carleton University in Ottawa. Two granddaughters. One is at Carleton also. She's a professor of English literature. And the other granddaughter in Toronto is a public interest attorney.
Oh.
And then 5 great-grandchildren, 3 from the daughter in Ottawa and two from the one in Toronto.
So you have no close kin living around here?
Not here, no.
Not here?
They all ended up in Canada because my wife was Canadian. She was born in Montreal, yeah.
Okay. And so how did you meet your wife?
In the Adirondacks, met in New York in 1942. Yeah.
Okay, so you're from New York, right?
Yeah, I'm from Fifth Avenue in Harlem.
Fifth Avenue in Harlem.
In Harlem.
You're right downtown New York, all right.
Yeah, right.
Okay. What about your parents? What do they do?
They're immigrants from what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And
so they came here from there?
Yeah, before World War I.
Okay. And what did they do?
Well, housewife, and my father was in the restaurant business.
Restaurant?
Yeah.
Austrian cooking, or?
Yeah, I'd call it European cooking.
European cooking, all right. Yeah. All right. Do you have any special memories about growing up in downtown Harlem? And
well, I remember vaguely having my tonsils out when I was about 5 years old, because I remember being awakened during the middle of the night and being served ice cream.
Yeah.
That memory is still there.
That made it worth getting your tonsils out, huh? What about grade school or high school? Any memories from those?
Well, I went to an excellent high school in New York called DeWitt Clinton.
DeWitt Clinton.
It was an all-boys school, had 12,000 boys in it.
Oh, is that right?
Between the main building and the annexes. And what I would like to say is I had a major conflict between whether I wanted to go in as a career in the study of classics, Latin and Greek, or being a chemical engineer.
Oh.
And I decided to be practical, and I chose the latter.
Well, why did you tend toward the classicals? What made you?
Well, I took 3 years of Latin. I was very much interested in Latin. And there was a 4th year Latin I could have taken, but it would have conflicted with a chemistry course I wanted to take. So I chose the chemistry course.
So you became interested in chemistry
we had
very early.
We had a teacher, a Latin teacher, who offered the class extracurricular course in Greek, which I took.
Yeah.
At the end of 6 months, there were 3 students left, and I was one of them.
It's
So
amazing how
I know a little bit about classical Greek.
It's amazing how teachers can influence us, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
This was during the 30s, and that was a great school, no question.
Okay. But you decided to go into chemical engineering. Was there some teacher that affected that too?
Well, I was interested in chemistry.
Yeah.
And we had a neighbor once, and we were talking one day, and I mentioned my interest in chemistry, and he said, well, why not be a chemical engineer? Because a chemical engineer could always be a chemist, but a chemist can't always be a chemical engineer.
There's something to
I
that.
decided chemical engineering.
Yeah. So you must have looked around for colleges, and you found one special college. Huh?
Well, in the 1930s,
Yeah.
and it was 1934 when I was ready for college. It was either a free college or nothing.
Okay.
And the one in New York was Cooper Union Institute of Technology. It was founded by Peter Cooper in 1859, who was an
1859?
1859,
Yeah.
who was an industrialist, and he founded it as a free college for architecture and engineering and science. And
he gave it a lot of money, as I recall. He was pretty rich.
yeah, in fact, the Cooper Union owns the land on which the Chrysler Building stands,
Oh, is that right?
and that's a major source of its income.
Yeah. Now, was
And,
Peter Cooper involved in locomotion? Was he involved in the steam?
Yeah, with that steam engine, that's right. That was
Okay.
one of his activities.
And he was an inventor of it, right?
Inventor of it, and was quite wealthy, and he founded that. And
And that's the steam engine that was used on locomotive
I
trains
think it was
and
called
ships.
it was called a Tom Thumb. I remember.
Oh, I remember
It
that.
was a railway engine.
Yeah,
It was a railway engine.
Yeah. But was it also used on ships? The same?
No.
No.
That's all a result of James Watt
A what?
with
Okay.
his.
Got it mixed up a little bit there.
And what's interesting about Cooper Union is that when it was open in 1859, they had a speaker that came to make a speech on the invitation of that newly formed Republican Party,
Ah,
whose name was Abraham Lincoln.
wow. That is something.
And he made his might speech,
Yeah.
which led to his being nominated for president. And in 1959, they had a 100th anniversary of that speech.
Okay. And
Yeah,
also the founding of Cooper Union.
Yeah, but the point is, they replicated his speech with an actor. Everett Dirksen was a keynote speaker, and it turned out that when Lincoln was invited to come to New York to talk at Cooper Union, his real interest was getting to New York free of charge and going to New Haven because his son was having problems at Yale.
Ah.
So that's the way things work out.
Well, I was impressed about reading about Cooper. Now, you graduated in 39. Right?
39, right?
With a degree, a bachelor in chemical engineering.
Right.
And then in 49, or was it 48, you got your professional
Yeah,
degree in
it was,
engineering.
at that time, Cooper Union had no advanced degrees,
Yeah.
but they did have what they called a professional degree in engineering that was based on experience.
Yeah.
And I got that in 1948.
And then they awarded you the Gano Dunn Award.
Yeah.
Now, what is that?
That's a reward that is given annually in memory of one of the early presidents of Cooper Union. And it's based on your history of your accomplishments.
Yeah.
And it was my colleague, I mentioned his name, Charlie Mosley, who insisted that I was eligible for it, and he did all the work and the application, and I got it. And I looked at the website once, of all the people who had gotten an award from Cooper Union.
Yeah.
And going down the list to the bottom, I found they also had given an award to a fellow named Thomas Edison.
Now, was Thomas Edison, was he a graduate?
No.
No.
I don't think, he may have attended some courses there, I don't know. But at least it puts me in the same league.
It sure does. All right. Well, let's talk about your jobs. You graduated as a chemical engineer, and you went to work for Foster Wheeler. And one of the first things you did was to invent something, right?
Well, during the the activity I had was design and sales and management of particular equipment used in oil refineries called the furnace, where most of the heating of the crude oil is done, and other materials. And I developed what was called a terrace wall furnace, which I see in the literature today on the internet is a major product of the company.
Oh.
And it's used mostly for the production of hydrogen from natural gas.
So what you did is take a mixture of natural gas and steam, that caused a mixture by heat, through heat in the oven.
You got it.
It made the mixture eventually into industrial
I don't want to go
hydrogen.
into the details. It'll take up too much time. But,
Yeah, okay.
but the point is, it wasn't a successful invention.
And it's still used.
It's still used. It's a major product of the company.
Any other projects that you intersect that?
There were some minor patents I got at the time that didn't go very far, but that was the important one.
Okay. All right, then you got involved with the Federal Radiation Council.
Oh, that came much later, yeah.
Okay. Well, was there something between...
Well, after I left Foster Wheeler, I joined a consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Arthur D. Little.
Was there something interesting there that you did?
And lots of things
All right.
over a 16-year period. And you mentioned my overseas work in developing countries before. But the Federal Radiation Council there was a great interest in the early 1970s in nuclear power and in the production of uranium. Mm-hmm. And in the uranium mines in the U.S., the atmosphere contained what they call radon daughters. Radon is a gas emitted, and it decomposes, forming a lot of radioactive compounds, and it was affecting miners' health. And it was a question of how to ventilate the mines to avoid this. And there was two parts to the study. One was how to ventilate, and the other was the epidemiological efforts, which we were not involved in. And it turned out, as a result, that what we recommended was already being implemented by the mining industry. And the Federal Radiation Council was later absorbed by the EPA.
No. Well, we have to test for radon, or we do test for radon in new houses or our houses today still.
Yeah.
I remember doing that in mine.
Yeah, it's a radioactive gas.
Yeah. Well, what about the underground gasification of coal in Ukraine?
That was one of the interests during the energy crisis in 1970. It was a technology that had been around for a long time, but it was thought this was a way to increase energy production from underground coal without having to mine it. And at the time there was
would you say that again? It's a way of doing what?
Getting the energy out of coal from underground without having to mine it.
Okay.
And we did a project for the Bureau of Mines to assess the state of the art. And the state of the art was in Russia, the Soviet Union, because Lenin had said this was a way to keep miners from working underground. And in Ukraine, they had developed that to a great extent. And we thought we might get a trip to the Soviet Union because the CEO of Arthur D. Little at the time was General Gavin, James Gavin. He had connections in Moscow, but it didn't work out. But it also turned out that the Russians had canceled that whole effort because it was just not
Wasn't feasible?
Yeah, feasible, and for a number of reasons, and they would be embarrassed to tell that to anyone. Yeah.
Well, did you in Ukraine, did you develop a successful gasification
Oh
project?
no, this was a survey of the state of the art.
Survey, okay.
Yeah, that's all it was.
So you didn't really get involved in.
And there was some underground gasification begun in the U.S. as a result. We visited one in Wyoming afterward.
And then you got involved in Nigeria's coal mining industry.
That came earlier. That came
Was
in
that
the
earlier?
60s, yeah. When I joined Arthur D. Little, it was at the time that during the Kennedy administration, the U.S. Agency for International Development was formed. And the Kennedy administration was going to use Nigeria as a great example of what foreign aid could do. And Nigeria had just become independent in 1960. And so I was approached to become involved in economic development. And I said, what would an engineer do in economic development? But they convinced me to do a study of the future of the coal industry in Nigeria, which had been developed by the British to produce coal for the railroads. And I did that, and I said, yeah, it was interesting. And that led to a residency in the north, in the city of Kaduna, which lasted 4.5 years.
And you lived there for it.
We lived there. It was a great time.
Was it?
Mostly because I had no communication with the Home Office. I could communicate by letter and telegrams, which were expensive. So there was nobody to tell me what to do.
Oh,
So I
okay.
was my own boss, and it was a great time. And we did some useful things, but I take too much time to talk about it.
Was your family with you?
My wife was. Daughter was grown up. She was going to Harvard at the
Oh,
time.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So she was in Harvard at that.
Yeah.
Well, did your wife enjoy living there also?
Without question.
No. Okay.
Without question.
Did you have a fairly large American community, or English community?
Well, it was a large expatriate community because at that time, Nigeria had 4 regions, and we were in the northern region that had its own provincial government, or regional government. And so there was a lot of nations represented there, I think about 28.
Well, you were there for 4.5 years. Did you have any other Nigerian projects? Other than just the coal?
No, it sort of ended afterwards.
Well, at the MITRE Corporation, you got involved in the production of electricity for Visa Columbia from using wood instead of expensive diesel fuel. You know, reading through your jobs, I'm impressed by the fact that when you went into a country and looked at their problems, you came up with different recommendations. Recommendations that might have differed from the previous project because of the circumstances. And this, I think, is one where you recommended that they use wood instead of the diesel fuel because it was so difficult to get the diesel fuel into the area.
No, actually, at MITRE, they did a major study on behalf of the Department of Energy to see how wood could substitute for the use of fossil energy. In all sorts of ways, and take a long time to explain the details. Yeah. And I was involved in the utilization of wood and the processing of wood to be able to replace the use of fossil fuel.
The diesel fuel, yeah. But the diesel fuel, they had problems because it took so much effort to transport it in. Is that?
No, it's the energy crisis.
Oh, the energy crisis.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No, this was the early 1970s.
Yeah. Okay. But in other cases, you looked at using fuel oils or natural gas to replace wood because that wasn't the thing to use. I don't remember.
Well, in general, yes.
Yeah. Well, in the Philippines, you worked with Coldwater slurry.
Yeah.
What's
one
that?
One of the ideas at the time was to make a slurry of very finely powdered coal and water with a high concentration of coal so that it could be used as a liquid instead of a solid,
Okay.
which would reduce costs. And We did a study based on a major coal field in the Philippines, and it was a successful study, and we even had an industrial firm that was interested in implementing what we had found, except they couldn't work with the Marcos government for many...
They couldn't work with what?
With the government of Ferdinand Marcos, because there were a lot of costs involved that had nothing to do with the project.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so also about that time, oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s. And once that happened, interest faded for many of the things that were going on.
The cold water, is that a way of getting, is that what we call clean coal? Or
No, it was just a way to use coal as a liquid.
So we still got all of the carbon releases and so forth.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's go to Pakistan, because you've done some major work in Pakistan. You lived there for how long?
Yeah, well, that happened in 1981, just after I joined the U.S. Agency for International Development, and that's when I first met my current colleague, Charlie Mosley, who was in charge of the energy and environmental program at the time. And we hit it off nicely, which eventually led to my having a 2.5-year residence in Islamabad at the end of the 1980s. And most of the effort was to try to develop Pakistan's coal resources, because the country had serious shortages of electricity, which still exists today. Yeah.
But you, so you recommended they use coal, but where would they get the coal?
Locally, but I think, if I remember correctly, Pakistan is the 12th largest country in terms of coal resource.
Oh.
And it's not used at all.
And they're not mining it at all?
They mine a little bit for the brick-making industry with very crude, primitive methods that are hard on the miners.
Yeah.
And,
Why would they not mine it? Was there a cultural problem or something?
You analyze developing countries, you'll get answers to that. It's,
well, I mean, they just didn't...
just difficult to get anything done.
Oh, I see. Okay, okay. Yeah, I understand that part.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're down to 5 minutes now, and I'd say the effects of moving from the use of renewable energy, or let's say that the products that we used in the early 1700s, like wood and animals for our locomotion and energy, whatever it might be, to the current, through the Industrial Revolution to the current day, where we're using mostly fossil-based fuels. And you've done a lot of work in that area too, haven't you?
Well, over the last 5 years here, mainly because living here, I have plenty of time with no responsibilities.
That's good.
And a computer and the internet and all that. Become interested in what to do about excessive carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere.
Okay. And
I think one of the things that we'd like to show is this picture here. If you look at this picture, there's a thin blue haze around the circumference of the Earth.
Yeah.
And that's our atmosphere.
And it's very clear, I think, on the...
Yeah. That's our atmosphere.
Okay. That's about, what, 20 miles thick or something like that?
Whatever it is, but it's awfully thin in relation to the size of the Earth.
Yeah.
And that atmosphere is the reason why we're here. And before the Industrial Revolution, it was a great ecological balance between the CO2 emissions that were going in and the trees that absorbed it and so forth. But once the Industrial Revolution occurred,
throughout the 1700s, from the 1700s.
Right. We pretty much forgot renewable energy, and everything became fossil energy, and the CO2 went into the atmosphere because the atmosphere would accept it without cost, was cheap. We went from 250 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere to 400, and that's caused a great concern worldwide. Everyone knows about this in terms of what it's going to do with climate changes and the economic and social effects of it. And so technology exists today to capture all of that carbon dioxide. We have a patent application that's another way to do it, which we think might be cost effective. We think we're going to get it.
Okay.
We don't have it yet. And so that has been our primary interest.
Now you have a table too, don't you, that shows numbers of. You have a table that we can.
Yeah. I'd like to show this too. The Lawrence Livermore Laboratory produces data every year that enables you to figure out where the CO2 emissions are coming from. And what this table shows for
Can we have the chart, please?
Yeah, to show for the consuming sectors that are shown there that the U.S. emits 5.4 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere every year. And the villain there is transportation. The internal combustion engine accounts for about 44% of that. The production of electricity is the next, and that accounts for about almost 40%, 39%. And of that 39%, it's about 50-50 coal and natural gas. And whatever is to be done to reduce CO2 emissions has to focus on those two major sources.
Okay, we're down to our last minute now. Let's sort of summarize that. Because what that says is that if we can take the transportation, the 44%, and if we could concentrate that in the production of electricity, which means electric cars, then we could control or at least
instead of trying to control from billions of sources, you concentrate it into a few sources where it can be controlled. That's right. Yeah.
And your patent will do that.
Right. And the one that we have now is a means of producing energy from producing algae, which we believe can take care of absorbing all of that captured carbon dioxide without letting it get back into the atmosphere again.
Okay. Well, Charlie, I thank you very much. I mean, you've really had an exciting career, from my point of view, having lived in all those countries and gotten involved in so many different things. I'm impressed. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you know, when you get to be 100 years old, I hope you're still as active as Charlie is.